Welcome friends, in this video I'm unboxing and upgrading my new network attached storage system, the Ugreen Dxp4800 Pro, to replace or really incorporate my old external drives into. This came shipped in another external box, and I thought this generic NAS box was the actual box until I opened it up and found yet another box within. The white box is your standard retail packaging, displaying the unit model and other marketing information. The box is sealed, so you can tell if it has been opened before. Inside is rigid foam packaging to protect the NAS, as well as a box of accessories. Inside of the accessory box, I found the manual and warranty, an HDMI cable, a screwdriver with screws for the hard drives, thermal pads for the SSDs, 2 Cat8 Ethernet patch cables, and the power adapter. The NAS itself is taped into some soft plastic packaging, which keeps the NAS, the magnetic dust filter, and the hot swap drive bays. This thing was brand new, but I don't like tearing stuff apart after I get it up and running, so I immediately set off to do all of the standard upgrades, starting with thermal paste. To disassemble the casing, I used a small flathead screwdriver to carefully pull out the 4 rubber screw covers on the back of the case. Then I used a Phillips head screwdriver to loosen and remove the 4 screws holding on the plastic back case plate, which would allow me to push the plate out from the inside and then pop it off. Next, I used the PH2 screwdriver to loosen and remove the 4 screws holding on the case fan. Then I could remove the fan and pop out its 4-pin connector. Next was removing the outer casing by removing the 4 inner Phillips head screws holding it on. On the bottom of the case, I loosened and removed the 2 screws holding on the SSD and RAM cover plate. Inside is this little plastic plunger, which needs to be depressed to slide out the inner chassis and motherboard. To pull off the faceplate, I removed the 4 screws on the back of the faceplate. These were very hard to remove since they were right up against the inner chassis, but I was able to get all 4 out and pulled off the faceplate. Next, I removed this single screw over the front I/O and flipped it over to pull out the 4 screws holding the motherboard to the chassis. The motherboard interfaces with the SATA drive connectors via a single PCIe connection, so I pulled the motherboard up and out, tilting the motherboard just a little bit to clear the rear I/O support. With the motherboard out, I could remove the 4 screws holding on the CPU heatsink and fan. Then I pulled off the heatsink and started cleaning off all of that factory paste. I didn't really see anything wrong with the paste, and it's new, so I've never had issues. I'm just repasting based on user reviews and reports that these CPUs aren't fully pasted from the factory, and that the factory paste they use is awful. I have no experience to support that claim, but I wasn't going to risk running it when I can easily just pull it apart before actually setting everything up. After cleaning off the old thermal paste, I applied some MX7 thermal paste on an attempted X pattern on both of the dies. Then I carefully lowered the motherboard upside down into the heatsink, lining up the screw holes and tightening down the 4 spring-loaded captive screws, trying to keep the same tension all the way around. Yay! Pasting complete. Now reassembly. I angled the motherboard to slide the rear I/O into position and carefully reinserted the PCIe connector into the motherboard. Then I reinstalled the 5 screws holding the motherboard to the inner chassis, snapped the faceplate back into position, and reinstalled the 4 screws on the back of the faceplate. On the bottom, I had a look at the operating system SSD, and I considered putting a thermal pad on it, but I wasn't sure how that would have worked when sliding over the outer casing, so I just left it be. Then I found the 2 rails which guide the inner chassis into the outer casing. I made sure that everything was pointed in the right direction, and I slid the chassis back in, making sure to depress the plastic plunger on the way down. Then I could reinstall the 4 inner screws on the back and get to the fan upgrade. I went with a black Noctua fan in 140 by 25, which is the exact same size as the stock fan, but the thicker cable made it difficult to install, and even after stuffing it in, I realized that I couldn't finish installing it because the stock fan has these recessed screw holes. So despite being the same depth of fan, the screws were too short. So the next day I went to Lowe's and grabbed some M4 by 35mm panhead screws and actually installed the fan. And as horrible as this sounds, the label facing the drives is not going to be right side up because of the wiring constraints, and I'm super embarrassed by this. I went to reinstall the back plate, and it was actually pretty hard because of this foam near the power port. It just wasn't letting me seat it properly, but I finally got it clipped in and tightened it down with the 4 original screws. The next upgrade was the RAM. This is the 64 gigabytes of RAM for my old laptop that I have not been successful in selling, and it's more worthwhile for me to put it in this instead of selling it for less than the cost of a new single stick. That it just doesn't make any sense. It does make me feel good to know that the OS actually uses the full amount of RAM as a cache, so this actually isn't a waste at all. For the M.2 drives, I installed some spare drives that I had from old laptops, and I was originally going to use a 512 and 256 together, thinking that I could cache them separately to different size hard drives, but I found that the drives must be used in RAID 1, so it would be a waste to keep the 512 in there, and I ended up swapping out the 512 with another 256, so now I have 2 256 gigabyte SSDs in RAID 1 as a cache. And don't forget the rubber screw covers and the thermal pads. Hard drives are expensive, which is why I didn't buy 2 8 terabyte cache drives, and it's also why I didn't actually buy any new hard drives either for this. I decided to shuck my current storage solution, which is 2 Western Digital external drives. I went ahead and pulled out the casing, removed the SATA adapter, and pulled off the rubber doodads with a Torx bit. I did my drives one at a time, deleting all of my backups to save space and drop it down to 1 active drive, since installing them into the NAS means reformatting the drives. So I slapped the larger 20 terabyte drive in, I threw on the magnetic dust cover, and I got her running. Alright, so final thoughts are that this thing is fantastic. It is basically a small PC with 4 drive bays, but it's packed with 10 gigabit Ethernet port and enough processing power to run a media server, backups, and even virtual machines if I really wanted. Right now, I've only got the 20 terabyte and 12 terabyte drives in it in basic mode, so this actually has 0 redundancy, and I'm only using half of the available space. But when I save up the money or prices drop enough, I'll be able to fill up the bays and run 4 32 terabyte drives in RAID 10. But yeah, I'll start buying lotto tickets to make that happen. The NAS itself is great, and the operating system has everything you need and is super easy to set up. The negative I'd say for this is that if you're not computer savvy at all, you'd probably still need help understanding a few things like setting up your network, hosting a VPN, doing the remote access, and setting up Dockers to maximize the use of this particular NAS. There are cheaper 4-bay options out there from Ugreen or other manufacturers, which can still do almost all the same stuff. I did spend all of my own money on this, including the upgrades, so this is not sponsored in any way, and I have no relationship with Ugreen. This device just seemed like the best current option for me to store all of my YouTube footage on, with some space to grow for drives, and the benefit of an Intel CPU at really a pretty competitive price. By the time I can afford or even need 6 drive bays, technology will have probably, moved further along. So this made the most sense to me. Anywho, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.